Single dad janitor kissed a billionaire to save her life, and then everything changed. This story begins with a moment so shocking that even now, people in downtown Chicago still whisper about it, because in a single breath, a poor janitor crossed an invisible line between power and desperation, and nothing on either side survived the same again. But before we dive into this unbelievable true story, let me hook you with this question. What would you do if the only way to save a stranger's life was to sacrifice your dignity, your job, and possibly your future? And if stories of kindness, sacrifice, and unexpected miracles move your heart, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel Kindness True Stories. Like this video, share it with someone who believes in humanity, and comment below where you're watching from, because your support helps us bring you stories that remind the world that compassion still exists. And now, let the story begin. Bernard Cole never imagined that mopping marble floors inside one of Chicago's tallest financial towers would one day place him face to face with a billionaire whose name appeared on magazines more often than the word mercy. Bernard was 36, a single father, and a janitor who worked the night shift because it paid $2 more per hour. And those $2 were the difference between his daughter, Molly, having asthma medication or not. His life had narrowed into routines that left no room for dreams. Wake before dawn, pack Molly's lunch, walk her 3 blocks to school, work a short morning cleaning shift at a clinic, then sleep for 4 hours before heading downtown for the night job. And yet, despite the exhaustion carved into his bones, Bernard never complained, because Molly's laugh still sounded like hope, and hope was the only currency he had left. That afternoon, everything changed. Bernard was called into the maintenance supervisor's office without explanation. Janet, the supervisor, avoided his eyes, her hand trembling as she slid a paper across the desk. Termination effective immediately. No reason listed, no warning, no appeal. Bernard felt the floor tilt beneath him. He asked what he had done wrong. Janet swallowed hard and whispered that it wasn't her decision, that someone higher up wanted him gone, someone powerful. And in that moment, Bernard understood something terrifying. He wasn't fired because of a mistake. He was erased because he was inconvenient. As he walked out carrying his cleaning cart for the last time, he noticed people looking away, as if association itself had become dangerous. He didn't know yet that this fall was engineered, or that the woman whose life he would soon save was the same woman whose name had silently signed his fate. Eleanor Whitmore, billionaire investor, philanthropist, and untouchable icon of Chicago's elite. Bernard didn't know her name then, only that fate was tightening its grip hours later. As Bernard stood outside the building trying to call anyone who might hire him before, Molly came home from school. A commotion erupted near the front entrance. A woman staggered backward, clutching her chest, her face draining of color. People froze, security hesitated, unsure whether to touch her, and in that frozen second Bernard moved. Instinct louder than fear, he dropped his phone and ran, catching her as her knees buckled. He lowered her carefully to the ground, shouting for someone to call 911. Her breathing was shallow, panicked, her lips turning pale. Bernard remembered Molly's asthma attacks, remembered what calm could do. He leaned close, speaking gently, telling her to breathe with him, slow, steady. But then something terrifying happened. Her airway constricted. Her breaths vanished into silent gasps. Bernard realized she was going into anaphylactic shock, a severe allergic reaction, and there was no EpiPen in sight. Her eyes fluttered, terror flooding them, and in a moment that would later explode across headlines, Bernard did the unthinkable. He pressed his mouth to hers, creating an airway seal, forcing controlled breaths, using a risky emergency technique he once learned at a community first aid class. Security shouted at him to stop. Cameras came out. Someone yelled that he was assaulting her, but Bernard didn't stop, because all he could see was Molly's face. All he could think was that no child deserved to lose a parent. Not today, not like this. Seconds later, paramedics arrived, pushing him aside, administering treatment, stabilizing her, and as they loaded her onto the stretcher, Bernard backed away, his hands shaking. His job already gone, his dignity torn apart by shouting strangers. And yet she was alive. He didn't stay to explain. Because he couldn't afford trouble. He went home to Molly smiling through fear, making dinner from canned soup, pretending the world hadn't just cracked open beneath their feet. But the next morning, Chicago woke up to a different story. Headlines screamed about a janitor who kissed a billionaire. Footage cut to make him look like a criminal. Commentators speculated motives. Security claimed misconduct, and behind closed doors, Eleanor Whitmore opened her eyes in a private hospital room and asked one question that would change everything. Who saved me? And that question would pull Bernard back into a world far more dangerous than poverty, because kindness, when it collides with power, never leaves things the same. And this was only the beginning of begins the morning after the headlines tore Bernard Cole's name into pieces. Because while the city of Chicago argued over what they thought they saw, the truth was quietly waking up. Inside a private hospital room where Eleanor Whitmore stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment her world went dark. She remembered panic. She remembered the cold grip in her chest. And most clearly she remembered a voice, calm and steady, guiding her back from the edge. When her assistant leaned over and showed her the footage circulating online, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar twist in her stomach. Shame, because the man being dragged across screens like a villain was the same man whose breath had kept her alive. She demanded answers immediately. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why was he fired hours before the incident? And with each answer, her expression hardened, because patterns were emerging. Threads connecting a janitor's dismissal to decisions made in rooms she controlled. Meanwhile, Bernard's reality was collapsing in quieter ways. Molly came home from school clutching a crumpled note from her teacher asking if everything was all right. Kids had whispered, parents had stared, and Bernard realized the damage was no longer just his. It was reaching his daughter. That night he sat on the edge of the bed, calculating rent he could no longer pay, asthma medication he couldn't afford, dignity he had already lost, when a knock came at the door, sharp and official. Two men in suits stood outside. Not police, not security, but something worse. Corporate investigators. They asked questions wrapped in smiles, suggesting lawsuits, hinting at criminal charges, pushing a narrative that Bernard had acted inappropriately. That his kiss was misconduct. Bernard understood the message clearly. Disappear quietly or be destroyed publicly. After they left, he held Molly while she slept, realizing kindness had placed a target on his back. Across the city, Eleanor was refusing to sleep. She ordered a full internal review of the building's security logs, employment records, and termination requests. And when she saw Bernard's name attached to a vague complaint filed hours before her collapse, her breath caught. She recognized her own signature. Automatic, careless, approving a recommendation without context. And now a man who saved her life was paying the price for her indifference. She demanded Bernard be brought to her, quietly, respectfully, but Bernard didn't come willingly. He was terrified, convinced this was a trap. But when he finally stood in that pristine hospital room, wearing his only clean jacket, he saw not a billionaire but a woman struggling to sit up. Eyes wet, voice unsteady, she apologized before he could speak. Apologized not as a public figure, but as a human being, telling him she owed him her life. Bernard didn't know how to respond. Years of being invisible had not prepared him for accountability from power. She asked about Molly, about his work, about his dreams, questions no one had asked him in a decade. And when he told her he just wanted stability for his daughter, Eleanor looked away, swallowing guilt. She offered compensation, money, legal help, a job, but Bernard shook his head, saying he didn't save her for reward. He saved her because it was right. And those words landed heavier than any accusation ever had. Because Eleanor had built an empire on calculated generosity, donations with returns, kindness with conditions. And here was a man who gave without expecting anything. After Bernard left, Eleanor made a decision that would send shockwaves through her company. She ordered the suspension of the executives, involved in his termination and opened a public investigation into discriminatory employment practices. The media narrative began to shift, slowly, cautiously. Meanwhile, Bernard's life didn't instantly improve. Bills still waited, fear still lingered. But something new followed him now. Attention, strangers offering help, reporters asking for interviews. And through it all, Bernard remained grounded by Molly's small hand in his. The story took another turn when Eleanor released a statement acknowledging Bernard as her rescuer and condemning the attempts to discredit him. Chicago watched as a billionaire humbled herself publicly, but behind closed doors, something deeper was forming. Eleanor invited Bernard back, not as an employee, but as an advisor, on a new foundation focused on dignity first aid and emergency response training for low-income workers. Bernard was overwhelmed, unsure if he belonged in that world, but Eleanor insisted, telling him that systems only change when people who understand suffering are allowed to speak. And as part 2 comes to a close, Bernard stands at another edge, not of survival this time, but of transformation, because saving a life had bound him to a woman whose power could either crush him or help him rebuild. And neither of them yet understood the full cost of what kindness had set in motion. Unfolds at a pace Bernard Cole never asked for and never imagined. Because the moment Eleanor Whitmore publicly acknowledged him as the man who saved her life, the world didn't slow down for gratitude. It accelerated with expectations, scrutiny, and consequences that reached far beyond a single act of kindness. Chicago media now followed Bernard everywhere. Outside Molly's school, near their small apartment, even at the grocery store, and while some called him a hero, others searched hungrily for flaws, desperate to tear him down, because society is often uncomfortable with goodness that doesn't fit a narrative. Bernard tried to shield Molly from it all, reminding her that being kind was never wrong, even when it hurt, but inside he wrestled with fear, because power had invited him into its orbit. And power rarely did so without a price. Eleanor, on the other hand, was facing storms of her own. Board members questioned her judgment, donors whispered concerns, and executives resented the way one janitor's story had exposed years of silent injustice. Anonymous leaks surfaced accusing Bernard of manipulation, suggesting the rescue had been staged, and each rumor felt like a blade aimed at both of them. Eleanor called Bernard late one night, her voice tired but steady, telling him that change always provokes resistance, especially when it threatens comfort. She asked him if he still wanted to move forward with the foundation, and Bernard hesitated, not because he doubted the mission, but because he feared the impact on Molly. He had lived his entire life trying to stay unnoticed, and now he was being asked to stand at the center of a movement. After a long silence, he said yes, not for recognition, but because he remembered the moment Eleanor couldn't breathe, and how many others were left without help every day. The foundation launched quietly at first, training janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, people who were always present but rarely empowered. And Bernard insisted on one rule: dignity before publicity, no cameras during training, no speeches that turned people into props, Eleanor agreed, learning to listen in ways she never had before. Their partnership began to shift her perspective. She spent time in neighborhoods she once only drove past, heard stories that challenged her assumptions, and slowly the hardened billionaire image began to fracture. But not everyone welcomed this evolution. A former executive named Richard Hale, whose termination had followed Bernard's firing, launched a lawsuit claiming wrongful dismissal and defamation, and his legal team dragged Bernard's name into it, alleging that Eleanor's favoritism toward him had corrupted the process. Bernard was subpoenaed, forced to relive the incident under hostile questioning. Lawyers twisted the kiss into something sinister, insinuating motives, intentions, and impropriety, and for the first time Bernard felt anger rise. Not for himself, but for every worker whose humanity was reduced to suspicion. The moment they crossed an invisible line, the courtroom became a battlefield of narratives. But Molly's quiet strength grounded him. She told him one night that her teacher said being brave didn't mean not being scared. It meant doing what was right anyway. Those words carried Bernard through testimony after testimony. Eleanor took the stand as well, admitting her failures openly, acknowledging systemic blindness, and refusing to let Bernard be used as a scapegoat. The judge eventually dismissed the claims against Bernard, citing lack of evidence and clear intent to save life. And while the legal victory didn't erase the trauma, it sent a message that kindness was not a crime. After the trial, something unexpected happened. Eleanor invited Bernard and Molly to a small dinner at her home. No staff, no cameras, just a meal cooked by Eleanor herself. Awkward and imperfect, but sincere. Molly laughed freely, exploring a world she had only seen on television. And Bernard saw Eleanor not as a symbol of power, but as a woman learning how to live differently. Yet even as healing began, Bernard faced a personal crossroads. Job offers poured in, some genuine, others exploitative, and Eleanor offered him a permanent leadership role within her organization, complete with salary, benefits, and security. Everything Bernard had once prayed for, but accepting meant fully stepping into a world of influence that could change him. He sought advice from Janet, his former supervisor, who had quietly supported him through the chaos, and she reminded him that integrity wasn't about where you stood, but how you stood there as draws to a close. Bernard accepts the role with conditions: transparency, worker representation, and Molly's well-being placed above all else. Eleanor agrees without negotiation, understanding that this partnership is no longer about saving face, but about rebuilding trust. And as Bernard walks out of the building that once fired him, now welcomed as a voice for change, he knows the journey isn't over, because kindness may open doors, but it also demands courage to walk through them. And the final test is still ahead, brings the story to its final turn, not with headlines or courtrooms, but with the quiet weight of choices that shape lives long after the cameras leave. Because Bernard Cole learned that real change does not arrive like a miracle. It arrives like responsibility, heavy and unrelenting, yet deeply meaningful. Months passed in Chicago, and the foundation Bernard helped build began to ripple outward. Janitors, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, and security guards trained not only in emergency response, but in self-worth. People who had always been invisible now carried confidence in their posture. Eleanor Whitmore watched this transformation with a humility she had never known, because, for the first time, her wealth was not leading the story. Her listening was. Bernard adjusted slowly to his new role, still walking Molly to school every morning, still cooking simple dinners, still reminding himself where he came from, because he never wanted his daughter to believe that kindness was a ladder out of poverty, instead of a way to live. Regardless of it, Molly thrived. Her asthma stabilized, her laughter returned fully, and one afternoon, she stood on a small community stage beside her father as the foundation opened its first training center, not in a corporate tower, but in a neighborhood that had been ignored for decades. Eleanor spoke briefly that day, not as a billionaire, but as a survivor who owed her life to a stranger. She told the crowd that the most dangerous lie society tells is that some lives matter less than others, and Bernard felt tears sting his eyes, because he knew how close his life had come to being erased by that lie. The applause that followed was not thunderous. It was steady, genuine, and earned. Later that evening, Bernard received a call he never expected. Janet, his former supervisor, told him she had been reinstated and promoted. After speaking up during the investigation, she thanked Bernard for reminding her that silence was a choice, and that courage could be learned. Bernard realized then that the chain reaction of one act of kindness was still unfolding. Even beyond what he could see, Eleanor faced her own reckoning as well, stepping back from boards, restructuring leadership, and declining deals that conflicted with the values she was still learning to practice. Some called her naive. Others said she was ruining her legacy. But Eleanor understood now that legacy built on fear was never worth protecting. The final test came quietly one winter night when Bernard encountered a man collapsed on a subway platform. People hurried past, just like they once had outside the tower. And without cameras or recognition, Bernard knelt, helped, waited, because kindness didn't end when the story did. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Bernard's apartment, handwritten from the man he helped, thanking him for seeing him, and Bernard smiled, understanding that this was the true ending. Not wealth, not fame, but continuity, the passing forward of humanity. And so as this story closes, remember this. Bernard did not change the world because he kissed a billionaire. He changed it because he refused to look away when someone couldn't breathe. He refused to be silent when power tried to erase him. And he refused to let bitterness win. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness still matters, then support our mission by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs hope, subscribing to the channel Kindness True Stories, and commenting below what part touched your heart the most. Because every like helps these stories reach further, every share keeps compassion alive, and every subscriber helps us tell more stories that prove even the smallest act can change everything. This is Kindness True Stories, where humanity always finds a way.